Hey everyone, this is Julian Kamer from OnBlock. I'm joined by my colleague Koen de Boer, and in this short conversation, we're going to explore the topic of politics. So, when I was sharing an early version of my upcoming book with Koen, he told me, "You know what? You're missing something. You don't at all talk about politics. While when it comes to strategy, decision making, and meetings, politics is quite an important topic." So, Koen. Um, I'm really curious. Like, what is politics for you? How would you define it?
Well, if you look at everyday organizational life, like there are many interests going on. You have the interest of the company, which
Hmm.
everyone, of course, wants to serve, but you also have people have self-interest. They might have ambitions within the company, or there might also be ambitions a department or a team has, and they all
Hmm.
point at different directions. And I think this is what politics makes, because this is where all of these ambitions come together and they make, well, they can become quite messy, because if you're sitting
Hmm.
in a meeting, everyone might be there with a different aim.
Hmm. Hmm. So, but that sounds like not too. That sounds like it's pretty neutral. While when I think about politics, I think about, I don't know, people jockeying for power, people using their elbows to climb up the corporate ladder. Um, what do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think this is what happens a lot, right? Because this is where the different self interests are underlined, and you might even create. And some organizations aren't designed well in order to in order to canalize those self interests, because
Hmm.
it's not something we like or want to talk about, and that
Hmm.
we basically push it away. And what you see happening, that it then turns around and sometimes kicks you in the ass, so to say,
Mm.
because all of those self interests aren't aligned. We talk about a topic, but we're not really talking about what's really there. Is that like, well, this topic is really important to me because if I nail this, I might get a promotion, or
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm afraid that if I'm representing my department interest, and if they're not showing in a specific project or an important outcome the company has, I feel like my job or my department gets less important, and therefore we might lose jobs. So therefore,
Hmm.
push
Hmm.
my self interest. While you can question, yeah, well, is this the right thing to do? And this is
Hmm.
where company interest, self interest, department interest sometimes clashes with each other.
Hmm. So it's about um, intentions that are hidden. Is that what it is? Like I'm doing something, but I'm mostly doing it for my survival in the company or for my promotion in the company, while it might not necessarily be the thing that's best for the organizational purpose. Is
Well,
that how you would?
yes and no. And I think this is, you ask me like, hey, some you have this bad connotation if you talk about
Hmm.
politics, but for me, politics doesn't need to be bad. If you read
Okay.
some authors have written it as like, hey, well, this is a natural thing of organization. uh,
Hmm.
there can be a lot of creative energy around it, because if you are able to talk about these different interests, sometimes a third way or a third option might show up that's good for all. But I
Hmm.
think where politics turns sideways is that it's really hard to align these things, and because we don't talk about them openly, it becomes sometimes a fight instead of a conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, and like when does it derail? Like, what is the moment where it becomes a fight? Maybe there's an example that you can talk about, or.
Yeah, well, for example, when I was a manager myself, we sometimes had st- the struggle. We I worked at a company where the revenue wasn't going well, and
Hmm.
because of that, there was a question of like, hey, we might look into who can. Well, do we need to fire people? And of course, when you have that going on, you really want to take that up as a team and say like, well, of course we don't want to fire anyone, but if we're like going to point at each other, it's not going to work. So we need to work together. So that was
Mhm.
pretty clear. But at the same time, if you are firing a lot of people or firing certain people, that also damages your interest as a department. And it's really hard to talk about these things because also it also gets really personal sometimes, and
Mhm.
a lot of anxiety popped up for me because I was like,
Mhm.
I find it difficult to fire people, or I don't want to fire that person because of a lot of reasons, and this is where
Mhm.
it becomes really blurry.
Yeah, so it's like there's when there's not a lot of safety, uh, people do things and hide them. Is that what it is? Like, because still, like you say, like politics it can be a positive thing. Can you say more about that? Like, how can politics be positive in organizations?
Well, if we talk about an organization is a very complex phenomenon, right? With all
Hmm.
of these different interests flying around. But
Hmm.
if you're able to make them transparent and talk about and see like, well, maybe in my example, if we would talk about maybe all of these things, we might come up with a solution of like, hey, maybe we can outsource some of these people in order to save costs. Maybe
Hmm.
there is a third way. And because we don't talk about our uncertainties or about the real problem that's at stake, it's also really difficult to find like that third option. And
Hmm.
we basically get into, and because we don't talk about it, also we don't like to make decisions, and if you don't make decisions, reality cuts up with you, and then
Hmm.
making those decisions gets more and more difficult. So
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
it's where decision making shows up in order, uh yeah. Am I making myself clear, or do you need?
Yeah, yeah. So you mean like what you're saying is that politics shows up in decision making as well, and especially when there's a paralysis,
Yeah.
where like it seems that nobody really wants to make the decision, or the decision is just not made.
Yep.
Um, how do you deal with that when that happens? When you notice it, like, oh, we're blocked, like we're not making any progress. What is something you can do?
Yeah, no, I think there, and this is where I think that's also why I reached out to your book. And that's why I noticed there wasn't a lot of there around politics. But I think
Hmm.
a few things that are really interesting is that having a really clear process of how you make certain decisions really
Hmm.
helps.
Hmm.
Because within politics, because if there is already a basis of anxiety, and it's also not clear how certain decisions are made, then it becomes more of a fight because you feel like, oh, I need to come up for my own interests.
Hmm.
And if there isn't a clear process where you can put these these doubts in, then that fear only heightens, and those
Hmm.
interests only get more hidden, and therefore what we perceive as politics only becomes bigger.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that was really interesting about the things you write in your book about, for example, integrative decision making and
Hmm.
dealing, for example, with objections, having
Hmm.
a really clear process on how do you deal with objections and what objections are, for example, uh, personal. Because, for example, what I'm sharing in the previous example, some of the things were really like personal preferences or
Hmm.
personal things I needed to deal with. But some of them were really clear objections, and really defining that line and having a honest conversation with each other. Hey, like, what is my personal preference here? What's my, maybe
Hmm.
also my personal interest? What gets in the way of this higher thing and of making
Hmm.
sure we don't go bankrupt? And what are things that decisions we make that might get us not, maybe not bankrupt us right now, but maybe 2 months later because we made the wrong decisions.
Hmm. Hmm.
And because we don't make that explicit in our decision making, and we don't have that honest conversation about what's a real objection and what's a personal, what's a personal preference, that
Hmm.
makes those decisions go derail really quickly into. Because as soon as I put my personal preference in front, then it opens the floodgates for other people to do the same.
Mhm.
And then you really get that political conversation, like, well, where you feel like you need to defend
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
your own, for your department or your team. And so,
Mhm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is the decision making clarity, especially on the rules of the game, helps. Um, I also got from your conversation that, or from what you said about, it's all about unmet needs, right? So if somebody seems to be reacting irrationally or emotionally, there's usually a need behind that is not met. And when you're facilitating decision making, it's all about finding a way to uncover what is the actual unmet need there, or what is actually causing, for example, fear or anxiety, or that or despair that somebody's having, and maybe there's a way to address that, other than just blocking decision making, paralyzing everything, slowing things down. Um, so yeah, what else would you recommend if you sense something is happening?
yeah, and maybe going back to, you mean in decision making or in general?
Yeah, yeah. Like, if things are being slowed down because of seemingly political things,
Yeah.
what can you do?
And I think what a few things is that if it's really hard to make a decision, then it really helps to start with, well, what we like to use a lot in the integrative decision making methods, to come up with a proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens if you're in a swirl of politics, then trying to grab all of the point of views into one proposal and run really clear proposal in order to move you ahead as a group is crucial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you have something tangible and where you feel like where you've integrated all of those decisions, being it for better or for worse, then using the process of first asking clarifying questions, then everyone can bring their reactions. And
Mm-hmm.
from that, you can improve the proposal, or and of course, if the reactions are completely counterfeit, you can also always see like if you need to adapt a proposal in a conversation, but you have
Mm-hmm.
something really tangible where you can have make a where you can have a discussion around.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I think on the one hand the process helps, and on the second hand, it also, if you have that process really well described, and it's clear for everyone how you follow that process, it's easier for everyone to join and also be peaceful with whatever
Mm-hmm.
comes out, and you diminish the political discussions surrounding that.
Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking that maybe some people open up this video to and are curious about what to do about that colleague, the colleague that is always doing things for their own personal benefit, at the cost of others, or maybe that person that has this win-lose mindset where it's either I win and you lose, or I lose and you win. Like, how do you deal with people that are like that, or that are inherently doing all those things to climb the corporate ladder,
Yeah.
and all this bad behavior that is pretty stereotypical, but definitely exists in organizations? What to do about those people?
Yeah, and if we really focus into decision making, this is where I think like the part, if you have come to a with all the reactions, and you've come with a adapted proposal where all of these
Hmm.
reactions are in, and you then explain the concept of consent versus consensus,
Hmm.
where consent is about, hey, this is in within my zone of tolerance, and this is something where I don't have an objection around,
Hmm.
and where you say like, because if we are here to all agree on the decision and we all
Hmm.
liking the decision, we're
Hmm.
having to make here a very difficult decision. So we probably will never come to that place.
Hmm.
We need to move forward in this, because else it becomes only worse.
Yeah.
And this is where the consent versus consensus really helps and really kicks in order to
Hmm.
help also to move forward and define like, hey, what is then personal interest, and what's then interest, which is important, which informs if this decision is a right decision, and
Mm-hmm.
actually an objection which we need to integrate into this proposal. And I
Mm-hmm.
think having that distinction really helps to, and this is again where I say, like, hey, politics isn't bad. It's about canalizing what's important to move you ahead and integrate the
Mm-hmm.
things that are important for the company. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore it becomes a little bit more rational in the sense that it drives out the topics that are important to integrate, and also lose the topics that aren't important, which are
Mm-hmm.
more personal preference.
I would say like that is true. And if I'm really talking about that colleague, they might consent to the meeting, but just don't do it in action. All right, maybe just find ways behind your back or behind other people's backs to still get his or her, but most more often it's a his way. Like that can be very derailing to a
Yeah.
team. Um, yeah, I don't know if there's a solution for that, but like that's what I think about top politics in this worst sense, right? You agree something, somebody else, behind your back, find that creates alliances with other people, and then ultimately something else is being done. Um,
And what I've learned is that people give their best behavior depending on the situation. So that
mm-hmm,
immediately ask questions me like, hey, what what have you designed as a company in order
mm-hmm,
that that person drives out this behavior?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
what you see more often than not, that sometimes there is a promotion scheme that's
mm-hmm,
invalid, or there is a which is very uh, or there is a bonus scheme in place where people feel like, oh, I really want to have this bonus because of
mm-hmm,
X, Y, and Z. That are more general things that you can look at.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and again, it won't solve everything, but in general, I think you won't. I mean, um, we probably won't change it, but if you're making a decision in that sense, what we just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
that it's also about, okay, implementing that decision. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and if you have consent and everyone agrees to execute it, you can always add more process to it
Mm-hmm.
to say, like, to see like how much committed everyone is. So sometimes you can do a fist five exercise
Mm-hmm.
where you say like, hey, I'm totally in, I'm going to execute it with as a one, or and a five, or the other, sometimes do it the other way around. So five, I'm totally in, and
Mm-hmm.
one is more like, oh no, this is the worst decision, I'm going to leave this company.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a helpful add-on into the process. But then
Mm-hmm.
again, if it's the really a-hole you're described, that
Yeah, what can you
still
do?
might not even work. But then again, yeah, that um,
But
yeah,
what I take from that, Koen, is that you can design your organizational ways of working in a way so that the system at least doesn't work against you or doesn't promote or creating conditions for this type of behavior or allows it to happen. And the second thing you're saying is like you can have ways of working where we rely on integrating perspectives so that there's not one or two voices that can dominate the conversation, right? And if you have those structures in place, politics will be less painful.
mm,
You can find a way where people can get their individual needs met, even if they're selfish,
yeah,
and still create outcomes for the organization that are helpful.
yeah, yeah. And if you look, I think your if I read all of the things I'm reading now from your book, I think they're what you're basically proposing is a way of working where all of these political ambitions get canalized in a way that it becomes, for the things that are important, that they get a place, and for the
Mm-hmm.
things where they can derail, it's also really clear that it's derailing and therefore it doesn't need to have an attention.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think if you talk about meetings and a different way of meeting, where you, for example, talk about um, like at every, if you change the way you're setting up a meeting, where it's not about going through like some meeting format, talking points, but you're actually asking, like, if everyone wants to bring a topic, and you're opening with the question, with a really
Mm-hmm.
powerful question is, what do you need?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
such a powerful question, because if you need to answer that, and the question is like, well, I'm here to serve my personal interest, and my need is that you all agree with this topic. Of course, this will create questions like, oh,
Yeah.
why should we do that?
Yeah, but a real politician wouldn't reveal their intentions, right? Immediately. But I hear what you're saying. Like, if you show up with your needs, and if you have a good facilitator that kind of double clicks on that and say, "Sorry, I didn't really hear your need. Can you say a bit more about what you actually need?" Then that might surface earlier. I agree with that for sure. Hey, Koen. So we're almost at time. What is one other thing that we should really talk about before we close this conversation about politics?
Uh, yeah, no, but I think that was one other thing. And I think also, if you look into strategy, if you look how
Mm-hmm.
you design it, um, how now normally strategies are made is that there are wish lists of a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is also where politics thrive, because if there is a
Okay.
wish list of 10, then you can easily add a number 11 and number
Mm-hmm.
12,
Mm-hmm.
number 13. And this is where politics thrive. And it becomes again a little bit of a who can shout the loudest that their priority is not
Mm-hmm.
number 11, but gets to number 1.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What you talk about, the strategic intent, really clarifying, like, hey, what are the 5 most important things, or 3 most important things for this company? That also, and there you say, like, and from there, every individual department can see like how much they can add value to that topic. Still
Mm-hmm.
do their own thing, but the question is, how much of those priorities can you integrate in your own priorities and or goals?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then you design basically for and the personal interest of the individual and the personal interest of the company, and of the company, but make
Mm-hmm.
it really explicit. Like, hey, let's be transparent. There are different interests at play here. Let's make it
Mm-hmm.
transparent, but also make really explicit what the most important thing for the company is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
that's interesting because indeed these kinds of prioritization and strategy setting exercises are often filled with people pushing for their own idea. And yeah, I guess it does require a pretty safe space for somebody to say, you know what, no, your idea is not good for the company. And how do you objectively test that? Like, instead of just getting into a yes or no battle, creating a team or a leadership team that kind of looks from the perspective of the organization and is able to comfortably disagree and still move forward together. I think is also pretty key to reducing some of those work
yeah,
politics. Yeah.
and that's what I think all the things you're describing in your book. I mean, it's still, if you have that colleague which we have in our minds, that is an asshole and goes only for their personal interests. But if you put all of these things in place, if you look at that perspective from an org design perspective, like, hey, let's design a company which aligns all of these personal interests and company
Mm-hmm.
interests in the best kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also more easier that we show up with the best behavior. To be
Mm-hmm.
honest, when I was a manager, and I was in that political arena, I also didn't always show up in the best way I could.
Mm-hmm.
If you create an organizational design where you make that more explicit, and you can have more of these conversations about what's company interest and personal interest and
Mm-hmm.
department interest, and align that better, then you create clarity, I think,
Mm.
and you move forward from these difficult political conversations.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Koen. This was super helpful. I'll definitely take some of that advice and find a way to integrate it in my upcoming book. Yeah, and for those who are viewing, hopefully this was interesting to you as well. Leave a comment if you liked it. See you soon.